guys, welcome back for the second lecture. This week, remember, we're talking about female juvenile delinquency, and we're really looking at the differences between males and females. Today, we're going to look at really just specifically the facts. So we're moving through and talking about female delinquency. This week, we're going to look at more just what the facts are. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. My phone rang and I can't remember where I left off. It was the sheriff. You got to answer the phone when the sheriff calls. Anyway, so we are going to move on and talk about some of the stuff that we do know based on research. So in the last class, we kind of talked about some theories and things like that, but we're going to look at actual things that we know statistically in the system. Okay. So hopefully you can see my PowerPoint and you can, and I'll be clicking through it. Okay, so to start off, I just want to talk about this idea that even though we're studying female delinquency, understand the majority of delinquency is still committed by males. So males really are the ones that commit the majority of delinquent acts, but that doesn't diminish the need to understand the female role in delinquency. So you can see, especially when it comes to serious violent crimes, it tends to still be a very male-dominated area, but that is starting to change. But we had said before that most violent crimes are going to be male and the female are going to be like more property and drug types of crimes. Now, like I said, this is starting to narrow. It is starting to change. So in 1995, every 3 male crimes, there was 1 female delinquent act. Today, that's just 2 to 1. So it is reducing and females are playing a more active role, I guess you could say, in delinquent acts. So women are having a more significant role. Now, when you look at the delinquent acts, you can see that the majority of them are, like I said, property types of crimes. So you're going to see a lot of those property types of crimes. Oops, sorry. Trying to do 2 things. I can't do 2 things at the same time. So you're going to see more of the variety. Oops, I did it again. Jeez Louise, we're having a crazy time here. I just needed to call up my notes real quick in case I had to check something. So I apologize for that. So as you can see, the majority of female delinquent acts are these like more minor offenses, almost like the UCR we will call like the part 2 offenses. And they tend to be property crimes and drug related. And in fact, almost all of them are drug related. The property crimes are often directly linked to the need to get money to purchase drugs. So a lot of times that's what happens, that you have those kinds being the most common. We also talked about in the last class, a lot of them tend to be sex offenses, again, related to money. So a lot of times the females to go to the streets to find companionship, but also to make money to feed their drug issues. Okay. Excuse me. So that tends to be with the female delinquent acts that you see. Now, we talked about risk factors and protective factors last week. When you're looking at risk factors and protective factors, they tend to be the same for both males and females. But one of the things that's really significant when you look at these risk factors is the idea that we said if you were abused or have if you have physical, psychological, emotional abuse, that is a significant risk to becoming delinquent. What you see with female delinquency is that a large percentage of female delinquents actually have suffered from some sort of abuse, 92%. So you see less abuse among male delinquents. You still have it, but it's less. You see significant abuse with female delinquents. So 92% of all females that commit delinquent acts report, and these are ones that just actually reported, they report that they did experience some physical, sexual, emotional abuse prior to their first delinquent act. Okay. Other things that are risk factors, especially for females, are the lack of parental supervision. We see that at a higher rate. That's a more significant risk factor for females. And another more significant risk factor they're both still risk factors for males, but they tend to cause a larger risk for females. Is also socioeconomic status. So abuse, lack of supervision, and socioeconomic status tend to be more significant risk factors for females than males. Okay, but they still are for both. Now, another thing that we know is that the age of onset. So remember, we talked about the age of onset last week. The age of onset is what is the first age that the person would most likely first become delinquent or begin using antisocial activity, which leads to delinquency. And the research shows that female delinquency, their age of onset tends to be similar to boys around the age of 15. So that's very similar. But we do have some research that females can start a little earlier at certain times than males, maybe contributing to or maybe caused by some of the abuse. And then we know that they it's more pronounced with serious and aggressive types of delinquency. So we have a little bit earlier. If you have a little earlier onset, age of onset for females, it tends to then lead to, in the future, more serious levels of delinquency. Okay, so in general, it's basically the same, but there is some research that is showing that it could start slightly earlier for females. And if you start earlier, we know that it often leads to more advanced levels of delinquency. Okay, now, how long do women or do females stay delinquent? So remember, that's duration or persistence. How long do you continue to engage in delinquent activity? We know that males tend to have longer duration or persistence of delinquent activity. So usually a female's duration is only about 8 years, where males will stay engaging in delinquent acts for a longer period of time, probably closer to 10 years. So that's one of the distinctions between males and females. Now, there has been a lot of research out there about how females and males are treated in the juvenile justice system. So there's been some research that they're not necessarily always treated the same. Okay, so we do tend to treat people different in different settings. And I think we talked about the chivalry factor last time. That could be part of it. But these are some of the facts that we know about their treatment in the juvenile system. We know that females are less likely to be put in custody. So they're less likely to be, custody is arrest. So they're less likely to have that actual custody. Again, maybe because of the chivalry factors that we talked about. But we do know once they're taken into custody, they are much more likely to be petitioned. So actual formal charges are much more likely to be pressed against a female once they are taken into custody. So we know that. We know that we know police officers are more likely to place females in custody for sexual related delinquency than males. So if they find a female engaging in delinquent acts that are related to some sort of sexual behavior, then we know that it is more likely that the law enforcement officer is going to take those people into custody than when they see a male engaging in sexual delinquency. Okay, sexual delinquent acts. So we do know that. So they tend to ignore that behavior more for males. We know that if a female is petitioned and there's going to be an adjudication, we know that female delinquents are less likely to be waived to adult court. So remember, we talked about waiver in the very first week. Waiver is when you're taken into juvenile court and there's some process where they have now decided to charge you as an adult. So they're going to waive you out of juvenile court and put you into the adult court system. So that's what we call waiver. We'll look at waiver a lot more later with more detail of why and discretion and all that stuff. But basically, we know that females are waived to adult court at a lower rate than males. So there's less waiver to adult courts. And then we know that there's some research that females may be treated harsher. So if females are taken into custody and they are petitioned and they're adjudicated, when you get to the disposition, when you get to sentencing, there is some research that shows that females are more likely to be sent to detention center, or I'm sorry, to detention centers. Yeah. And I'm sorry, this one is different. Once you are in custody and you are petitioned, females are more likely to be held in detention prior to the adjudication. Okay. So if there is a petition and the court has to determine what are they going to do with this juvenile prior to the adjudication. If you're female, you're much more likely to be held prior to your adjudication or your trial. Okay. Sorry, that's what this is. And then the next one is the disposition. I just got ahead of myself. So we know that there's some contradicting evidence or research, but studies tend to show that girls may receive harsher punishments, dispositions than males. Okay, so there is contradiction. There's some studies that show that they receive harsher. There's some studies that show that they receive more lenient, maybe the chivalry factors we talked about. So that is kind of contradictory, but a lot of research does show they may receive a harsher disposition. Now, we do know that once girls get into these institutions, so if they're institutionalized, if their disposition determines the sentence should be institutionalized, like prison, like we would call for adults, we do know that girls in those facilities tend to have a much higher rate of aggression towards the people that work within the institution. So the facilities tend to have more aggressive females inside that are more aggressive towards the staff that work there. Another significant thing, and we're going to talk about why this is significant later in treatment programs, is we tend to know that girls that end in these institutions tend to suffer from a significantly higher amount of mental disorders, internal and external mental disorders or issues. Okay, so they tend to have much more psychological issues, which is going to be important when we look at treatment. If we know that they suffer from significant abuse, if we know that they suffer from significant mental issues because of a lot of the abuse, how do we treat them and what programs do we create based on that information? Another factor that they know through the research is if females are placed in institutions, if they are given long-term detention, dispositions, or they're institutionalized for long periods of time, those female delinquents tend to exhibit significantly more severe long-term consequences. So a lot of the research shows that if there's a female delinquent that is sent to an institution for long periods of time, they have higher mortality rates once they get out. So they die at a younger age. They suffer higher mortality rates. They suffer a variety of psychological issues even after their release. They tend to still have a lot of psychological issues. They tend to be involved in very dysfunctional and abusive relationships. They tend to have a very poor educational achievement. So they tend, even though they're getting schooling and things like that, probably in the institution, they still have poor academic achievement once that they are released. They often have very unstable and unproductive work histories. They can't maintain jobs. So they're leaving jobs and they have low income jobs. You tend to see consistent alcohol and drug abuse that continues even after the institutionalization. Because of a lot of these factors, they often then rely on social assistance much more than males do when they are released from these institutions. They also are much more at risk of becoming victims even after they're out of the institution. So they have a much higher rate of victimization. And they reproduce at much younger ages. And then because they're young, when they have children, they often do not have the resources that they need to care for their children. So they don't have the emotion, not just financial, but social, emotional, and financial tools that they need to care for their children. And then you often see this cycle of delinquency then continuing on with their children. So not that male delinquents don't suffer from some of these things, because they do. But what the research shows is that females tend to suffer from it at a higher rate. than females. So females suffer from a higher rate than males. Males don't suffer quite the long-term effects as males. Now, another interesting fact that they found is that when you're looking at delinquents in males, male delinquency, there seems to be significant difference between how minority male delinquents are treated and how white Caucasian males, delinquent males, are treated. When you look at females, that does not seem to exist to such an extent, okay? So racial differences with female delinquency do not seem to be as pronounced as they do with male delinquents. So that's kind of an interesting fact to note. Now, let's think about if we have a typical female delinquent. So think in your head, if you picture what you would picture the typical female delinquent, how would you describe that person? You know, their socioeconomic status, their schooling, their education, their IQ, their family life. How would you describe that person? So what we're going to do is look at some of the key components that would make up what is considered a typical female delinquent. Not all females fit this. This is not absolute, but it gives you an idea of some typical characteristics that you would see. Okay, so the first thing is psychological. We've already kind of mentioned this. We know through research that female delinquents suffer a significant higher rate of psychological problems. Again, a lot of that could be based on abuse, because we know most of them have experienced some levels of abuse prior to their first delinquent act. But we see significant psychological problems. And a lot of times they often have very dysfunctional and violent relationships with either their family or a partner or friends. They do not have functional social interaction with others. We also know specifically that they have psychological problems. We can point to some specific things that we see. They have higher psychopathic deviation, meaning that higher level of psychopathology. They have higher levels of schizophrenia, paranoia, phobias, obsessions, compulsions, and anxiety. So those are all psychological diseases or problems of the mind that they suffer from. Again, males do suffer from some of these things, but you see a higher rate of female delinquents suffering from these types of problems. Socialization. We see some differences with females for socialization. We see that many of them come from troubled homes. So we've already talked about the abuse. So we know that a significant amount of them have suffered from emotional or physical or sexual abuse. Based on that, there's surveys that say 68% fear their father and 55% are afraid of their mother. And that's pretty significant. And then 30% report some sort of sexual advancement made by a family member. So it all ties into that abuse. Sometimes it's physical and emotional, but a lot of times it is sexual abuse that can trigger the cause of female delinquency. Also linked to this is drug and alcohol abuse, which could again be directly linked to this abuse that they are suffered. We see increased gang membership. So a lot of the female delinquents that are in the system have some sort of a gang affiliation, also with males, but you see it with females. And oftentimes we see those weak bonds with family, which we've already talked about, bad relationships with family and friends and relationships, but poor bonding with parents. Now, what can we look for the future? So let's look at some future predictions for female delinquency. What do we see arising in the future? Well, we are seeing an increased need for more research of female delinquency. The majority of research that's been conducted was conducted on traditional male delinquents. There was very little money, research, attention paid at all to distinguish or even see if there was a significant distinction between male delinquency and female delinquency. That is changing. And we are seeing more and more resources dedicated towards studying specifically female delinquency and also researching best programming and treatment for female delinquents. One of the factors that has led one of the things we've discovered through all of this research is the idea that females often are much more involved in gang activity if they're conducting more violent crimes. So remember, most female delinquency is property crimes and drug-related offenses. When you start to see female delinquents engaging in more violent crime, it tends to oftentimes be associated with gangs and gang-related violence. So some of the research has shown that. Now, there are many different theories of what's happening. So remember my first slide, I said that the ratio used to be 3 to 1, male commit 3 delinquent acts, female 1, and now it's gone down to 2 to 1. So one of the things that they study now with these increased money and things like that is why? Why is female delinquency on the rise? And there's different theories or reasons why they think female delinquency is increasing over the years. So one of them is the liberal feminist views, or they call sisters in crime. And this is the idea that as women are more engaged in traditional male things like sports and politics and male dominated professions, they become more likely to engage in criminal activity like males. So they're sort of being more similar to males, okay? So as males, the division between male and female in daily life, sports, occupations, things like that, sort of starts narrowing. We don't have these big divisions anymore between males and females. It also leads women to start engaging in activities that males were traditionally male, like delinquency. Okay, so that was one of the things. The next one is the criminal feminist view. The criminal feminist view is based on what we call gender equalities and unequal power that males have. Okay, so the idea for the critical feminist theories was that females were traditionally just treated like commodities by their fathers and by their husbands and by the male figure, right? They were just male commodities. And there wasn't equality. Women didn't have the same equal standing socioeconomically as males. And the idea is women start to develop equality again, then they are going to engage more in criminal activities, okay? So that's one. And then the last one is power control theory. And the idea is that men have unequal power over women. Females have less power, obviously, than males have. And so the idea was that originally we had a very paternalistic family. The father controlled everything and sort of dictated what could happen to females in the family. The females didn't really have any say. And as women are trying to exert more power and they're trying to escape that male dominated paternalistic family, then it leads to more likely to women then engaging in delinquent activity. Also with this is the idea of the more recent trend is the idea that women and men, when they marry, it's an equal family partnership. Women and men are equal, which didn't always exist over history. Many different times, people believe the male is still the dominant person in the family, has final say over things. Well, as women start to have equal power within their relationship, in relationships, and it could be a delinquent age, you're going to see an increase of females engaging in delinquent activity. So that is just some of the theories why women are more likely to commit more crimes now. They're just some modern theories, no real scientific proof that any of these are true. So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is going to play right into your discussion for this week, is what we call effective female delinquency programs. So we said there's an increase of funding for delinquency, for studies in female delinquency, because most of the research and everything that existed was dealing with male delinquency. So with increased funding and increased attention, one of the things that they have found is they need to develop specific gender-based programs. So that is one of the key takeaways, that we cannot treat male and female delinquents different, the same. They are different. and what would treat a male delinquent, a program that's designed to help a male delinquent to no longer become delinquent, may not be the same for somebody that's a female delinquent. So you're starting to see attention and research really paid towards developing these gender-specific programs, and not just gender-specific, but when we looked at protective factors and risk factors, you could see that different people can engage in delinquent acts for different reasons. They may have different risk factors and different protective factors. So not only is it important to design programs that are specific for male and females, we're starting to see more and more attention paid to designing programs that are specific to the individual delinquent. So there's no one size fits all. People have to have an assessment. We need to see where they're having difficulties, figure out where they need programming, and provide individual treatment based on gender and also based on individual needs. Okay, so one thing that we know is that if you can design a program individually for a female delinquent, they tend to be very effective. These programs tend to really greatly reduce continued duration of female delinquency. We know that the things that work best in these programs are somehow creating a nurturing and safe environment for that female delinquent to be part of. So we talked about one of the causal factors a lot of times is that they don't have the support supervision of parents. We talked about that in the last lecture. We know that effective programs often, if they can create that nurturing, safe environment, it can drastically reduce continued delinquency for females. And then based on what we said about females with the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, often leading to significant mental issues, we know that female delinquency programs need to have a substantial component in them that deals with mental health. So those are some of the things we know are successful so far. Again, this is really in its infancy stage. There's not a ton of stuff out there on female delinquency. So we're just touching on a few areas that are sort of known, but a lot of this is still unknown. So what you're going to do for your discussion this week is you are going to compare two different states. So there's two states that have really tried to make great strides in individualizing their treatment of female delinquents. So there's Connecticut and Florida. In the weekly materials, I have posted summaries of both of their programs. So that is what you're going to use for your discussion this week. You want to read over the summary of each of those, and you want to look at what are some of the programs that they advocated? Which ones do you think are most productive? And then when you compare the two states, which state do you think has a better program and why? Okay, so we're going to kind of look at some of the different programs that do exist out there. So that's all that I have for this week. Hopefully it was interesting, and I will see you next week. Next week, we return to book material. We'll be back to chapter 3 in the book, and we're going to be specifically looking at theories of delinquency. So we talked a little bit about theories of female delinquency. In the next class, we're going to look at in general, remember, is mostly based on male research. We're going to go through all the significant theories of why people become delinquent. So have a nice weekend, and I will see you.